This is Dr. Jerome Corsi. Today it's Friday. It's November 17th, 2023. Thank you for joining us on thetruthcentral.com. We're doing podcasts every weekday. Today I want to do another deep dive on this book, my new book, The Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism, and Anarchy. And the subtitle there is Exploring Woke Insanity in the Age of Disinformation. What the purpose of this book is to really try to explain how woke came about. And it came about through a combination of Maoism reforming and redoing Marxism. Essentially, today what we have is neo-Marxism is nothing like what the original Marxist theory was about. The original Marxist theory, written in the 1800s, was that the workers of the world were going to rise up against capitalism because their labor was being exploited by capitalists who were subjugating these workers to conditions of near poverty and stealing their labor. The workers were eventually going to get tired of this. They were going to rise up and they were going to eliminate private property so that we would own nothing but all be happy, as Klaus Schwab today has reinvented. Now, it didn't work. 1824, there were a series of revolutions across Europe, and countries did not go communist. What happened was that the countries essentially began the process of what ultimately in the 1900s became the labor movement. They began to realize that they had to share the wealth with the workers, and so therefore, going through the 1890s into the 20th century, you have a series of realizations that these big monopolistic trusts needed to be broken apart. Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century was very influential in trust busting. Big conglomerates that were put together by Andrew Carnegie or Vanderbilt and railroads, Carnegie and steel. These began to be subjected to antitrust laws. And that eliminated, as the labor movement built, we had the Wagner Act in the 1930s, which essentially established that collective bargaining was a way in which labor disputes could be resolved and workers could bargain for more pay and greater rights. All of this moved away from the idea that the worker class was going to revolt and go into a communist state. When Mao came along, I'm going to discuss his experience with Stalin, but Mao was a communist, and he decided that he was going to take over the leadership of communism worldwide in China. Now, Stephen Coughlin and Richard Higgins, I quote these two gentlemen quite a lot. They did a book called Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left, 2019. Richard Higgins got COVID and died in a hospital. He was a top counterintelligence military official, worked in the White House for a while with Trump, and I've always suspected that he was targeted. Stephen Coughlin also has had illnesses. The two of them wrote a brilliant book on, not a huge book, but it's a good book on this woke as a completely insane evolution of Marxism. That's the book right there, Chris. Thank you for finding it. So what Coughlin and Higgins say is Marcuse, who was the darling of the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse wrote a book called Eros and Civilization. No, Eros and Thanatos, I believe. No, I can pull the book here for a minute. I will. Yeah, here. Eros and Civilization. It's all about the love instinct and how we need to have uninhibited sex. That's the best way that we can produce a cultural revolution. After Gramsci, Italian communist, said in his prison notebooks between world wars that we need to attack the culture of capitalism. Marcuse picked up on that from the Frankfurt School. Eros and Civilization was a huge book in the 1960s. And Coughlin and Higgins realized that it was really Mao who executed the strategy. That's another version of it right there. There were two or three. There was also a paperback with a cover on it that was very kind of modern art cover with, similarly naked bodies on it. It was everywhere in the 1960s. I remember seeing it at Harvard. Okay, so let's get into the relationship between. First, let's start with Marx, with Mao's relationship with Stalin. Communists came to China pretty soon after the Russian Revolution. In 1919, Lenin formed the Comintern, which was a group that was designed to take communism worldwide. And this began in 1921. The Chinese Communist Party began to take shape in Beijing and Shanghai, and Mao Zedong emerged as the Chinese Communist Party's local secretary at the party's branch in Hunan. Hunan's a landlocked province in China, in south-central China, that was Mao's birthplace and it was childhood home. So in the 1920s, the Soviet Union urged the Communist Party in China to merge with Sun Yat-sen's Chinese nationalist movement, which was the Kuomintang, Kuomintang. I remember these as a kid because these were part of the Korean War, and I was very young in the Korean War, but I was able to understand basically what was going on. Now, there's a Professor Frank Dikötter, Dikotter, who is at the University of Hong Kong. He's written several books on this, on Mao, several very, very prominent and well-regarded books. His name is Frank Dikotter, Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. He said basically Stalin placed very little faith in Mao and his peasant soldiers, and the cooperation of the CCP with the KMT is what they called Sun Yat-sen's movement, the Kuomintang, KMT. So it was always called Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. It was the leader of the KMT. They had an army, and they were aiming the war, the nationalist Chinese, against the warlords of central China. China had been ruled by these warlords. A lot of China in history was actually not much ruled at all. It was mostly a peasant society, and central government just wasn't relevant in much of the country. Central government didn't emerge in China really until the 1900s. Now, Japan attacked China in the 1930s in Manchuria. 1931, Japan overran Manchuria and made it a puppet state. And in 1936, the KMT still exerted a loose form of control over about 2/3 of the population of China. Warlords still controlled much of China, and there was really no land reform. So in the late 1930s, Mao developed a strategy of changing the communist goal in China from a workers' revolution to a peasant revolution. Now, that's very important because that's a major shift. He's not going to concentrate on the workers. He's going to concentrate on the peasants as the first step to a socialist revolution. Mao evolved a strategy of operating from a stable base while harassing the government troops by guerrilla tactics. So in 1934, some 100,000 people broke through the KMT armies in south, one of the provinces of pronouncing these Chinese provinces, I'm probably going to butcher it, so I'm not even going to try. But they broke through in an area some 6,000 miles to the northwest, in a northwest province, which was called Shenxi. It was another landlocked province in northwestern China. Now, after this got done, Mao decided that he demanded a long march back to Hunan, where he was going to essentially take his forces and hide out for a while. He gathered his forces by waging a guerrilla war against Japan, and that's where he laid the groundwork for his later conquest of China. So the Long March provided a historic myth for the communist Chinese in the future, much like Valley Forge had for Americans. This was, when George Washington took the army into Valley Forge during a very bitter winter in the Revolutionary War. The Long March kind of deepened their sense of destiny, that they were destined to become the future rulers of China. So of the few hundred top communist leaders that still lived in the 1980s or the 1990s, they were veterans of that Long March. The Long March became a central theme in communist China's history. All right, now, eventually Mao overthrew Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen went to Taiwan. That's how Taiwan got established as an independent country from China. And China never did still hasn't today taken over Taiwan. We've been defending Taiwan since the 1940s and 1950s. And it was a big issue even in the campaign with John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, discussing Taiwan and Quemoy and Matsu, two other islands that were part of this independence from China. Now, in 1946, Mao's People's Liberation Army and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist KMT fought each other, and in April 1948, Mao, his PLP, crossed the Yangtze River, which was the last line of defense that was preventing the Chinese communists from taking Nanking and Shanghai. Shanghai is a port city. But by 1949, Mao announced the creation of the People's Republic of China from Beijing, which at that time was called Peking. That was China's old capital city with a more than 3,000-year history. When you're dealing with China, you're dealing with an ancient country and a population that has largely been isolated from the rest of the world until recently. Now, Stalin sent airplanes and advisors to the KMT, and Mao got very little from Stalin. So Mao was a peasant. Dictator explained that, I'll read a passage, Mao was a peasant, a caveman Marxist. Stalin determined after reading translations of the Chinese leader's writings, which he dismissed as futile. There was a rebellious and stubborn streak in Mao. It was clear his victory over Chiang Kai-shek, forced to retreat all the way to Taiwan, would have been difficult to explain otherwise, but pride and independence were precisely what troubled Stalin so deeply, prone as he was to seeing enemies everywhere. So Stalin and Mao were really rivals, and they saw each other as rivals. Mao got very little help from Stalin through the World War II period, and Mao was deciding that he was going to move away from Stalin and establish his own brand of communism in China. Now, Stalin died in 1953, and that's when Mao saw a chance to really secure independence from the Kremlin and claim he was the leadership of the entire worldwide socialist camp. Mao essentially assumed that he was the leading light of communism and that he was the one who was going to crush capitalism, making him the historical pivot around which the universe evolved. Okay, so Mao gets power, and then he begins to see the need for a second revolution. Okay, now let's explain why. Less than a year after this liberation, what Mao did is he had the Great Terror. He was determined to eliminate enemies of the party. Entire villages were razed to the ground. School children as young as 6 were accused of spying or tortured to death. By the end of 1951, close to 2 million people had been murdered, sometimes during public rallies and stadiums. In 1951, Mao turned on former government officials. Over 1 million were sacked from their jobs. 1952, Mao attacked entrepreneurs. In more than 2 months, 600 entrepreneurs, business owners, and shopkeepers killed themselves in Shanghai alone. So, and then Mao began a process of collectivization, which is moving the peasants off of their land and putting them in collective farms. Essentially, the Mao's policy of collectivization of farming proved devastating, with Communist Chinese admitting in 1954 that farmers had a third less food to eat compared to the years before liberation. Virtually everyone in the countryside was on a desperation diet. Then in 1957, Mao turned against the intellectuals, sending 500,000 to the Gulag. And he began a policy of drives to eliminate all opposition, whether it came from ethnic minorities, religious groups, farmers, artisans, entrepreneurs, industrialists, teachers, scholars, or doubters within the rank of the party itself. Now, this is what happens in communist takeovers, and if it happens in the United States, it will repeat, because these leaders who come in and promise everyone that they're going to have a perfect world, it's going to be a utopia, Marxist utopia, will eliminate private property, will destroy the capitalists. What they do in both Stalin and Mao is that they turn on their own supporters, they turn on their own people, they produce massive starvation, which I'm going to get to in a minute, and millions die. The first communism is marked by death and starvation. It is a depopulation movement. It's atheistic at its heart. They have no regard for people. They see people as basically a problem, useless eaters, and dangerous. Now, Marx did then the great leap forward. 36 million people starved to death. It was a great famine. Cannibalism was no longer exceptional. And so, the ancient annal report, there were families exchanging children to consume during famines. During the Great Famine, some families resorted to eating their own children. Okay, so this is the Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideologies. They're create these revolutions, but they are disastrous when the communists try to run a country after gaining power. So Dictator, in a book called Mao's Great Famine, The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, 1958 to 1962, made clear that in those years, China, quote, descended into hell under Mao's Great Leap Forward. Great Leap Forward was Mao's plan to overtake Great Britain economically in 15 years. So this whole idea of taking China from a peasant revolution to leaping it into being a modern industrial state with collectivization of the farms and undermining of the food supply. And again, you can see it repeats in all of this, the climate change movement, attacking the food supply, the intolerance of the woke, their desire to kill their enemies or to, brand their enemies as traitors. They have the Justice Department going after Donald Trump with a vengeance, and yet Biden gets passed on everything. It doesn't even look like anything's going to happen with this classified files case for Biden. Of course, Trump is going to have 150 indictments on it. Same thing. It's completely a one-sided justice system. But just to give you a detail on the nature of this totalitarianism, Dictator explained the following: the Chinese Communist regime considered no cost or coercion too great in making the realization of communist ideals the supreme goal of the entire population. The peasants bore the chief burden of realizing these ideals. They shouldered the cost of industrialization, of subsidizing the cities, and the extravagant habits of the officials at every level. It's happening in the United States today. The rich are getting fantastically rich, and 80% of the population has less money than it did before the pandemic. Those figures just have come out from the Federal Reserve this week. Most of this cost was imposed through the state monopoly for purchasing and marketing. Peasants were obliged to sell their produce to the government at prices that did not cover their costs, with official priority placed on feeding the burgeoning urban population and importing machinery in exchange for grain exports, grain was all but snatched from peasant mouths. So the PRC brutally suppressed People's Republic of China political dissent while running a highly centralized planned economy that resulted in, quote, an abuse of executive power exceeding that of the Soviet Union or of any of China's emperors, controlling politics, the economy, culture, and ideology, and every aspect of life. Okay, so now this again had apologists. We covered in previous session Durante and how he came to China during this period of time, and Soviet Union at that time, and praised how wonderfully Stalin was doing while Stalin was murdering millions in his collectivization. And you had the same kind of repeat. An American journalist, Edgar Snow, and I remember these books too when I was a kid, was writing books like The Red Star Over China. He interviewed communist leaders, including Mao, and he wrote that the communist Chinese movement sought, quote, to awaken China's millions to a belief in human rights, to combat the timidity, passiveness, and static face of Taoism and Confucianism, to educate, to persuade, I have no doubt at times to beleaguer and coerce them to fight for, quote, the reign of the people, a new vision in rural China, to fight for justice, equality, freedom, and human dignity. That's what was being published about communist Chinese efforts, while China was brutally murdering millions. Now, in 1956, Stalin gave a secret speech Khrushchev gave a secret speech after Stalin died, 3 years after he died, in which he took the reputation of Stalin and said that Stalin was a brutal failure who was engaging in a cult of personality. Khrushchev detailed Stalin's purges that involved the torture and execution of wholly innocent party loyalists. In 1958, when Khrushchev proposed peaceful coexistence with the West, a concept Mao viewed as a betrayal of the principles of revolutionary communism, what Khrushchev demonstrated was that Marxism-Leninism might have successfully put the communists in power, but by pursuing a policy to reduce Stalin's importance, Khrushchev was abandoning leadership of the global communist revolution to protect the interests of Russia as a nation state. So Khrushchev's attack on Stalin, Mao saw as a risk to his power as head of China. This could happen to him in China as well. And so therefore, Mao decided that the country needed a second revolution, and he engaged in a cultural revolution. This fully brought Gramsci's vision of attacking the culture of capitalism into play. So Dickeder writes, and again, his books are brilliant on the communist Chinese. Mao's family. He's written, I think, 4 books altogether on Mao. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was the second stage in the history of the international communist movement, safeguarding the dictatorship of the proletariat against revisionism. The foundation piles of the communist future were being driven in China as Chairman Mao guided the oppressed and downtrodden people of the world toward freedom. Mao was the one who inherited and defended and developed Marxist-Leninism into a new stage, that of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Now, what the Cultural Revolution did was it went through several phases, but it unleashed, after the misery of the Great Leap Forward, it unleashed the Red Guard and these youth in China with their little red book of Chairman Mao's sayings to go after all aspects of the culture. And they engaged in these politics and tactics of shaming. So Mao Zedong launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution as a decade-long period of political strife and social chaos, with the youthful, student-based paramilitary social movement organized by the CCP, the vanguard of the Cultural Revolution, which was the Red Guard. Mao's decision to launch the Cultural Revolution is widely interpreted today as an attempt to destroy his enemy by unleashing the people on the party and urging them to purify its ranks. So in the first phase, the Cultural Revolution attacked the Communist Party itself. By the time it was over, it ended up in a civil war between the generations, where the youth were attacking the elders within China's society as well as the institutions. Mobs of Red Guard youths waving their little red books of Chairman Mao's quotations caused chaos throughout China. The Cultural Revolution ended up as a civil war between the generations. The Red Guards roamed the streets of major cities, closed universities, destroyed churches, burned libraries, toppled historical monuments and statues. That's the basis of that's the beginning of my book here, the truth about neo-Marxism, cultural Maoism, and anarchy. Now, this is exactly what Antifa has been doing in the United States. It's what Black Lives Matter has been doing. Again, it's these youths in a extremely violent confrontation of the history and culture of the United States, focused on attacking anything that looks like racism, because racism here is the central theme. And again, note we're not talking, well, it's neo-Marxism. It's aimed at racism, not at the workers' plight. Workers' plight today is, workers are much better off in the 21st century than they were ever in the 18th century or before. And this movement from peasant societies, which were pre-industrial and very small populations, capitalism was a very productive system in an interglacial warming period, which we're in right now, which produced the machines and the mechanisms and the science, the Enlightenment science, to create prosperity. But the Black Lives Matter and the Red Guards have a lot in common. So there's Doug Bandow, who's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and former assistant to President Reagan, described the Red Guard chaos during the Cultural Revolution. The images of the Cultural Revolution remain indelible more than a half-century later. People beaten to death, crowds of automatons waving red books and chanting in unison, accomplished professionals sitting wearing dunce caps while being harassed by baying crowds, demands for confessions of manifold ideological crimes, people fired, discredited, exiled, and impoverished by the ideologically crazy and politically manipulated mob. The normal, responsible, professional, and sensible being sent to re-education in the crazed ideological ruminations of a self-absorbed, aging dictator, Mao. Entire generation gone mad, without education or work, while passionately oppressing neighbors and governors at the behest of the Red Emperor, Mao, determined to reassert control of the People's Revolution while living in luxury in Beijing's imperial complex. It's being repeated today. We're in a redo of the Cultural Revolution. So the movement here, Black Lives Matter, is a repeat of the Cultural Revolution. And I'll quote another author here who perceives the same thing. He's named Tao Peng. He's a senior columnist for the Taiwan sympathetic Chinese language newspaper World Journal in New York. And he wrote, the Black Lives Matter movement can be rightly regarded as a cultural revolutionary movement, but it's not a cultural revolution in the sense of China's Cultural Revolution. The revolt is a bottom-to-top social movement that renews the resistance of long-standing cultural and structural or systematic racial discrimination in the United States and Western societies, requiring historical figures related to apartheid and discrimination to be reevaluated. So the uprising wants to establish an ideal society where individuals will not be discriminated against because of race. So that's the Black Lives Matter movement has been deeply inspired by the African American People's Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Feminist movement in the 1980s, Pan-Africanism, the anti-apartheid movement, hip-hop, the LGBT rights movement, and the Wall Street occupation movement, which has been called the New Civil Rights Movement. movement originated in the African American community and protested against violent and systematic discrimination against Black people. Okay, Black Lives Matter's protests also opposed broader issues such as racial induction, violent law enforcement, and racial inequality in the U.S. justice system. According to Coughlin and Hughes, a media compliant to the progressive agenda internalizes neo-Marxist values or dares not oppose the radical left movements like BLM for fear of being called racist. We should not be surprised to find media branded as fake news as reporting, not daring to challenge the radically left's politically correct agenda. So Peng, who is in favor of the Black Lives Matter, doesn't see essentially the correspondence to the Cultural Revolution in China, but as we say, the internal tactics of the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa are the same deconstruction or insurgency tactics that Mao used in the Great Leap Forward and subsequently Cultural Revolution to establish Communist Party totalitarian control over China, which is what we have now. So it's an ironclad system of social control that included an impermeable, organized bureaucratic structure, food rationing, starvation, controls on the population, on any population movement that was truly aimed at freedom, a disarmed population which had no chance of defending itself against the Communist Party and Mao's rule. From 1958 to 62, the government maintained a military strength of more than 4 million. The armed forces were well equipped and prepared to deal with foreign enemies and domestic strife. So we have a wholly developing a whole new strategy of Mao's idea of insurrection, which transformed Marxist-Leninist theory into a war against imperialism, which was viewed as a higher form of capitalism. And it is occupied with these tactics of violence. It's totalitarian. It won't tolerate dissent. Its media is compliant. And we're going through it again in the United States. And it's frightening. It's frightening if you understand. That's what this book is aimed to do, to make you understand that in Russia and China, what we're experiencing here in America today has happened before. And the end result is killing millions of people, weakening the country. It does not achieve social justice. It turns against the established culture, tears down universities. The universities are already all woke. The next thing that the movement will do is turn against the universities themselves because they aren't woke enough. The movement will become chaotic in the cities. The cities are already descending into chaos. These young revolutionaries are not trained in science or history, mathematics or reading. They're not trained in literature. They have only this angry revolutionary consciousness that is focused around the whole idea of racism. And that's, again, a new theme in communism because it started out with a workers' rebellion. It moved to a peasants' rebellion. And now it's a rebellion against racial issues of discrimination. And it will seek to champion the downtrodden, and the downtrodden will be including those whose gender is as they define it, but not traditional. It will include all kinds of concerns about microaggressions should you dare not to use the right pronouns in relationship to how someone identifies their sex. It basically becomes an identification of schizophrenia, and the society moves into chaos. Chris, I've gone on with this for a bit. I'd like you to comment before we wrap it up, but I thank you for following it through with various images to illustrate what we're talking about. But this is a period of time which needs to be studied again, just as Stalin's period of rise to power needs to be studied again. My book begins with making you aware of just how dangerous communism is as it gains power. And it's gaining power in the United States right now. It's going to take a lot to reverse this. Chris?
Here's another thing. The idea of destroying a nation's history, it sounds very easy when you watch what the academia, what the news media, and of course what these activists are doing these days and how to cover it. You're talking about a nation here in America that's about 250 some odd years old at the time. Mao and yes, obviously Lenin and Stalin had to destroy the history of ancient civilizations to gain control of the populace, which I found rather disturbing, if you will, because they were successful at that. Imagine how much easier, and it has been to do that. And yes, it was a more of a manipulative thing rather than one person being worshipped and doing that. Uh, uh, we can start with the annals of public schools and academia trying to stick these things in. And now what we have today are people who get this on TikTok. People, these young TikTokers are reading Osama bin Laden's letter to America and actually siding with him, not knowing anything about what the guy was saying. Look, you remember it was kind of a rambling piece of craziness. The fact is, it all comes together here.
Well, the insanity in the period of time like this is very difficult to stop. And as it builds, these are popular delusions. And it's happened before in human history. I mean, people became convinced that women were possessed by the devil and they started burning women at the stake. Insanity. They decided they had to go and take back the Holy Land. And these roving armies in the Crusades march across Europe all the way into the Middle East to Jerusalem to try to defeat the Muslims, take back Jerusalem. These ideas are very powerful. Human beings are captivated by these bizarre ideas, which ultimately are destructive. And, I'd include another bizarre idea, which is war.
Right.
Constantly human beings decide we're going to go to war. Well, that's again, a horrible idea.
But for these people to take over, it requires an ignorance of history. It requires an ignorance of one's own culture, and it requires basically a suppression of both.
And combined with atheism, it becomes very, very violent because human beings who do not have a moral consciousness, are not raised in a moral education, are very easily led by delusions and become violently opposed to those who disagree with them or want to argue with them. That this intolerance is violent, and it ultimately ends up being violent. If you lived through the Cultural Revolution, I watched it from afar, watching it through the news reporting, which was minimal, but I could see what was going on. This was a very frightening time because these mobs of youth coming through the cities were aiming to shame and destroy the existing culture, and they did. They burned down, churches, or libraries were destroyed, universities were attacked, people who of culture and education were imprisoned. It becomes a time when it becomes suicidal. At its core, I've always thought these movements are suicidal. Climate change movement, we exhale carbon dioxide. If you're going to demonize carbon dioxide as causing, well, then you're demonizing human beings. And the people constructing these movements know this, understand this. And once they can get the psychology placed in it, it's almost demonic because these people essentially lose their souls. And they essentially abandon any values that would be productive. Certainly Christianity gets attacked, and we're in a period of great persecution of Christianity around the world. And this madness is worldwide at the moment. And so we'd have Chairman Xi come into San Francisco. The governor, Newsom, cleans up San Francisco and puts red flags everywhere. Xi coming into San Francisco in his motorcade I didn't see a single stars and stripes. Saw all kinds of communist Chinese red flags.
Yes.
And so therefore, this insanity is destructive. And I want to wrap it up. So any last comment here, Chris?
We have to make sure that younger people from here on forward are more, and everybody here, not just the younger people, are more educated on what's on our history and our culture, not just ours, but countries across the world too. Because if you don't heed the culture, if you don't heed the fact that you should respect your freedoms and respect the society you're in, these Marxists will take over. They'll find a way. They usually kind of sneak in and look for ingrates or people who want to have a louder platform and elevate that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually gone to another stage. I'm going to wrap it up now. I think we're at a point where God will intervene with the judgment of God. We're going to go through a very, very dark period of time. War, economic turmoil, etc. But we have gotten too far away from the fundamental formulas that make human beings have values that are productive. So when you judge this woke movement by what it produces, you've got the transgender confusion, you've got chaos, you've got all the homelessness throughout the cities, you got the border wide open without any regard to who's a criminal, who's not a criminal coming into the country. You have lawlessness in the cities. Pretty soon the cities will be bankrupt. You're going to see failures in the banking system. We're going to go through a very dark period of time, and God's going to judge this in terms of the fact that we've abandoned God. The remedy for this is given in the Bible is 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is that we do need to get down on our knees and ask for God's forgiveness. We let it get to this point. We allowed God to be taken out of the schools of the 1940s. Roe v. Wade, we killed millions of babies, chopped them to pieces in the womb. These are sins against God, and God does not take these sins lightly. There will be consequences for these behaviors, and the consequences are going to be severe. But in the end, I believe God wins, because God, I do not believe, created the human race to fail. I think it will be a dark period of time, and I think we will perhaps come out of this realizing once and for all that this type of thinking, Marxism, communism, these are malware of the brain. They get into the brain, and the brain completely malfunctions and produces this bizarre behavior. So in the end, God will win, and I believe God will win here too. And I urge everyone listening to join me in 2 Chronicles 7:14, because the outcome of us getting on our knees and asking for forgiveness is God will hear our prayer and heal our land. And we need healing right now. And I believe as we enter into Thanksgiving season, which is around the corner, we should all pray that God does hear our prayer and does heal our land. It's Dr. Jerome Corsi. Today is Friday. It's November 17th, 2023. TheTruthCentral.com. We're broadcasting on a lot of different channels. In the upper right-hand corner of the TruthCentral.com website, you can see all the channels we're on: Rumble, BitChute, etc., audio only, Apple Podcasts, etc. We'll be back next week. Thank you for joining us. God bless.